Good evening. It is such an honor to be with you all as we bring Hanukkah 2021 to a close together and continue to shine a light on anti-Semitism. My name is Judy Alperin, and I am the Chief Executive Officer of the Jewish Federation of Greater New Haven. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Connecticut is enriched by the support and leadership of our many partners. Ours is truly holy work and extends beyond the bounds of the Jewish community. We are grateful for allies who work tirelessly to combat the forces of hate and recognize our partners, the NAACP, Urban League, Archdiocese of Hartford, the Connecticut Council for Interreligious Understanding, and the Archdiocese of Hartford Social Justice Ministry. Thank you to all 7 Jewish federations across the great state of Connecticut: Eastern Connecticut, Greater Hartford, Greater New Haven, Greenwich, Stamford, Upper Fairfield, and Western Connecticut, the Connecticut ADL, Jewish Federation Association of Connecticut, and the 4 Connecticut JCRCs. Shine a Light on Anti-Semitism is a major nationwide and Canadian initiative to address rising anti-Semitism through education, partnerships, advocacy, and the media. We hope that you noticed our dark purple billboards and signs throughout Connecticut designed to draw attention and shine a light on anti-Semitism as part of our awareness campaign. Our website, shinealightct.org, will remain up for a while to offer helpful information and links to resources to better understand anti-Semitism, along with tips to combat it, as well as links to our major partners. The federations JFACT and ADL believe that each of us has the power to eradicate hate and are grateful for the allyship of many interfaith and intergroup organizations who stand with the Jewish community as we combat hate in all its forms. Our program tonight will touch on difficult topics, and we hope that you have come to listen and participate in the spirit of allyship. In times like these, good people are called upon to stand up and speak out, to be the light that we hope to see in our world. Before thanking our wonderful panel and introducing Cantor Julie Cadrain of Temple Israel of Westport, I want to ask for your help in another important opportunity to shine a light. Professor Deborah Lipstadt, a noted and prominent scholar of the Holocaust and Jewish studies, has been nominated as the State Department's special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism, a post that has been elevated to ambassador status given the urgency and need. However, the Senate is stalling her confirmation at this time, and we will need your help to take action now. If you have an opportunity, let our representatives know that we should confirm Professor Lipstadt urgently. It's now my honor and pleasure to introduce Cantor Julia Cadrain.
Thank you so much, Judy. I'm honored to be with you all this evening to offer a song for us, a song for the season, in this season of light and of miracles. This song reminds us of our unconditional strength and perseverance as a community. Ma'od tzur Yeshuati lecha na'el eshabeach tikun beit tefilati v'sham toda nezabeach leitachin madbeach mitzaram nabeach azek moy beshir mizmor Chanukat hamizbeach azek moy beshir mizmor Chanukat hamizbeach. And now please welcome our keynote speaker, Oren Jacobson.
Thank you very much, Cantor. That was beautiful. And good evening to everyone. Thank you so much for being here Before I start the presentation, I want to go over a few quick housekeeping items. Number one, if you are hearing impaired, there is a live transcription button that you can click at the bottom of the Zoom screen to get a transcript live as we go. You should also feel free to submit your questions in the Zoom Q&A feature during the presentation, and we will cover as many of them as we can at the end of the program. As we engage tonight, my job is to help shine a light on our story. And I think it's really important as we start to say that this is not in any way intended to compare the Jewish experience, in particular the Jewish lived experience in America, with the lived experiences of any other community, but merely to help you better understand our community. And we're incredibly grateful to all of our non-Jewish allies who joined tonight in the spirit of deepening understanding. I also think it's really critical to say that when talking about anti-Semitism, Jews shouldn't be required to engage in a conversation about the conflict in Israel and Palestine as the price of that conversation. And yet, I think it's really critical that if we're going to have an honest conversation, that we also touch on Israel and Palestine. Most of this presentation has very little to do with that, but it is part of what we present here today. And none of it is intended to dismiss or diminish or erase the lived realities or concerns of the Palestinian people. To that end, we are going to talk about some difficult subjects which have a tie into many different community groups. And I hope that as we do this, we can do this with grace and compassion and trying to create a brave space, recognizing that some images and issues that we explore might make some of us uncomfortable because of the truths or perceptions of our history. I think it's really incredibly important that all of us can enter spaces of dialogue, recognizing that our communities need to do more work to address the bigotries each of us face. And finally, there are going to be some images and concepts here that may not be suitable for kids, in particular some images that are pretty graphic. And unfortunately, we don't have a way to truly tell our story and ignore some of the harsher edges and more graphic aspects of our history. And so today's presentation is titled, with all that said, The Oldest Hate. My name is Oren Jacobson. I'm the co-founder of Project Shema. The word Shema is Hebrew for to hear, to listen, or to understand, and that is what we seek to do to deepen understanding about our community in the hopes of building bridges between our communities. I'm the grandson of one of the 10% of Polish Jews to survive World War II, and that reality has driven my life in two directions. Number one, to stand up for the Jewish people, as well as to stand up for all who are attacked for the crime of being who they are. That is central, I think, to the idea of allyship, is locking arms and standing up for each other and with each other when any one of our communities are attacked. My grandfather was one of just 300 Jews in a town of 40,000 to survive from his hometown of Lublin, Poland. And some of you may know that nearly 3 million of the roughly 3.3 million Jews in Poland before World War II were murdered, which makes my life a statistical improbability. We are gathered here in a moment in time in which anti-Semitism is once again on the rise, and it is on the rise across the globe. Anti-Semitism is a hatred that knows no geographic boundary, no time boundary, no communal boundary, and no political boundary. It has been present in all eras and in all communities and in all political movements. Anti-Semitism is an issue that does impact every community, not just in the nature that we think about how our liberations are inherently tied, but because of how it works. See, anti-Semitism is built on conspiracy theories, and when conspiracy theories spread, facts and truth are undermined. And when facts and truth are undermined, democracy and civil rights are threatened, which means that all marginalized communities are impacted by the spread of these conspiracy theories because they threaten the democratic nature of a society and ultimately civil rights, which are necessary to protecting all of our communities, especially marginalized communities in this country and elsewhere. which means that anti-Semitism is ultimately a non-Jewish problem that most directly targets Jews, but impacts all of us. In fact, there is not a situation in Jewish history in which Jews have not suffered at the hands of systemic violence or systemic discrimination in which other communities have not also been attacked by those who are attacking us. To start the conversation on anti-Semitism, we really have to take one step back and answer a more basic question, which is, who is the Jew? And unfortunately, many in our country and across the globe misunderstand and misdefine who and what we are. In the American context in particular, most people see us or think of us as a largely white religious community. And this is inaccurate in a way that I'll touch on in a moment, but it's problematic in two specific ways. Number one, it actually erases a large part of our community, which is to say that a large part of our community does not present as white, even though somebody like me does. And in America, 80% of our community would be white presenting, while about 20% would be identified as Jews of color. But it also ends up erasing what it is that people hate about us, because skin color has never actually been determinative of Jewish safety. The problem is ultimately that we are Jews. As I mentioned, who Jews are, what we are, is far more complex and nuanced. Yes, we have a shared religion, Judaism. Some of us are deeply devout, ultra-Orthodox, and others of us are totally secular, but all of us are part of the Jewish people. We have a shared language and history. We come from all ethnic groups and races, and we have for many centuries identified through a national lens or as people. So we're not simply a religious group, but you ought to think about us more as a broader Jewish people. To understand the modern history of the Jewish people, we have to start in the year 70 CE, in the biblical land of Israel, when the Romans conquered and drove out violently most of the Jews. Today, we would use the word colonization to describe this experience. And while Jews have maintained a continuous presence in this land for thousands of years, it is in this moment, because of this violent expulsion, that Jews become a largely diasporic community over most of the last 2 millennia. Unfortunately, that story of expulsion is not isolated to that moment. In fact, expulsion, which is a whitewashed way of saying violent murder and the forcible violent removal of entire populations of Jews from wherever we lived, has been a consistent part of our story throughout. And that has led our community into a global search for safety. And as a byproduct of that global search for safety, our community actually looks like this. We are an incredibly diverse community, especially when you leave America and go into other parts of the world. And that diversity is by and large a reflection of this search for safety. Judaism does not evangelize, meaning we don't typically recruit new members into the faith. So this diverse collection of our community is actually a result largely of Jews seeking safety in the aftermath of expulsion. That's really critical as we turn now to the question of what is anti-Semitism. Most people think of anti-Semitism as a religious bigotry, because most people think of Jews, as I just mentioned, as a religious community. But really, anti-Semitism has morphed over time, and in its modern sense, is really about people. It is anti-Jew, not anti-Judaism. Even the word anti-Semitism itself is a racialized word. Its construction is actually framed by the Germans, who were seeking to verify and prove in their pseudo-racial science that the white Aryan race was the dominant race on Earth. And they had a problem because they had white-presenting Jews walking around their country, but they believed that the Jews were a uniquely evil race and a distinctly different race. So they had to come up with language by which to define Jews and separate Jews from from pure-blooded white Aryans. And they came up with the idea of being anti-Semitic, or the Semitic race or Semitic races. And even that construction, even that word itself, is a racialized word. It is really about who we are. We are attacked for being Jews, not how we pray. And that can be confusing because if you see an Orthodox man who got stabbed on the streets of New York, or you remember the Tree of Life shooting some 3 years ago at a synagogue, or you remember news from across the ocean in Europe of a kosher deli being shot up, all of those spaces or images are tied in some way to religion. But in reality, the synagogue was just a container to find Jews. The kosher deli is just a place where the shooters knew Jews would be, and the Orthodox man is simply a visible Jew walking down the street. The next challenge after sort of coming to that deeper understanding of what it means to be a Jew and what anti-Semitism is how anti-Semitism works, because like all forms of bigotry, it is distinct. Most of us in the American context think about bigotry through the lens of race, right? Racism is deeply tied to the story of this country's past, and over the last 400 years, white has been structurally and culturally on top in this country, and Black people have been at the bottom. And while it may be better to be Black in America today than at any point in our past, it is really difficult to conceive of a situation in which anybody who is on top could somehow end up on the bottom and be the victim of systemic oppression or systemic violence. Not that anybody is asking for that, right? Advocates for justice are calling for equality in this country. But it's hard to envision how anybody here could end up here on the bottom of this structure in a society. And because Jews are defined as white, most people then presume several things about anti-Semitism. Number one, that anti-Semitism cannot be systemic because a systemic bigotry wouldn't allow a group to rise. And number two, anti-Semitism can't be urgent because Jews are white and therefore on top, and therefore we are safe and secure in society. Unfortunately, anti-Semitism works a little differently. Anti-Semitism is ever present, but it surges and it spreads from the edges of society, from the fringes into the mainstream. And as anti-Semitism rises, it can cause rapid and sudden changes in the safety and security of Jews in a given society. If I took us back 100 years to Europe, 1921 Europe, you might use the word privileged to define some Jews across the European continent. Even in Germany, some Jews held positions of power or privilege or status in the culture, in the arts, in business, and yes, even inside of the German government. 20 years later, Jews across the continent were being loaded onto cattle cars, shipped off to the slaughter, the gas chambers and the ovens, forced to dig mass graves that we continue to find today. The challenge is that most people think about the Holocaust as a one-off aberration, when in fact the Holocaust is simply the worst example of a consistent pattern of Jewish life. So we find ourselves today in 2021, and you might once again use the word privilege to define the reality of some Jews in America. And we are standing here looking back at this history as we see anti-Semitism rise, wondering if this change might happen again. While we stand here and raise our voices, though, for reasons that I have explained, many people see us here and think that our line will continue and that safety and status will be permanently ours, while we are fearful of this fall once more because it has happened so frequently in our past. So as we turn now to anti-Semitism in action, again, I want to forewarn folks that there is some graphic content here, and we are going to explore some angles of this history that are complicated and potentially uncomfortable, and I wish we didn't have to, but I don't know how we can explore these honestly or bravely without doing so. I also want to talk about the idea of anti-Semitism as a virus, which isn't an idea that I or our project coined. But we stand here today in having lived through a pandemic. All of us are amateur epidemiologists at this point, and it's helpful to think about the virus analogy. We understand that when we are healthy, a virus may not be that big of a deal to us individually, and that when we are unhealthy, a virus can take our life. We understand that we may be immune to one variant of a virus, but be susceptible to another variant of that same virus. And we also understand now that when a society is unhealthy, the virus can spread rapidly and cause massive destruction. And the truth of Jewish history is a sequence of seemingly never-ending anti-Jewish pandemics of violence targeting Jews. And when we say never again, we are seeking to prevent that anti-Jewish pandemic from happening once more. Many people think about anti-Semitism as starting with the crucifixion of Jesus and ending with the Holocaust. The truth is, anti-Jewish ideas existed before this moment, and unfortunately, they exist long after the Nazis were defeated. It's really important to understand the role that this moment plays, and in particular, the Roman Empire accepting Jesus as the Lord and Savior in the 4th century, because as a byproduct of that, a story begins to be spread that the Jews are responsible for the death of Jesus, the deicide. And as a byproduct of that story, Jews become labeled as corrupt and greedy and disloyal because Judas compromised and sold Jesus's whereabouts to the Romans for money. And Jews begin to be defined as uniquely evil because only a uniquely evil people could participate in the murdering of the Son of God or of God himself. And so these 4 basic ideas that Jews are uniquely evil, greedy, corrupt, and not to be trusted spreads wildly as imperialist nations, wrapping themselves in the cloak of Christianity, push these ideas into the Western world. And it's really difficult to understand the Western world, which is nothing of any other world, without understanding the role that that reality plays for Jews. We mentioned the Roman conquering of Jerusalem, but in the 14th century, Jews were burned alive at the stake because of the plague. Jews have frequently been scapegoated and targeted for whatever the ills of a society, whether it be a plague or famine or economic hardship or war. Jews have often been the easy answer to the world's complicated problems, and Jews have been scapegoated by those seeking to maintain or get power, and that scapegoating has led to violence like this. In the 15th century, the Spanish Inquisition was an effort to drive out, to convert, and to murder Jews, to essentially rid the land of Jews. Throughout Europe, and indeed into the Middle East and North Africa as well, Jews were often forced to live in restricted areas. This is a rather benign artist rendering of above of Venice. This is the Jewish ghetto in Venice. You can walk through this area if you ever find yourself there. It's beautiful. But these bridges can be closed off, and the Jews of Venice could be restricted at any point in time from traveling outside. This is important because systemic discrimination is a large part of Jewish history, especially outside of America. In fact, the idea of equal civil rights for Jews is only an idea that is roughly 200 years old in this world. The violence and discrimination wasn't isolated to Europe. At the same time as Hitler was rounding up Jews across Europe, you had mobs in the streets of portions of the Middle East, and you also had political leaders who were often supportive of the Nazi regime. This was happening in 1941 in Iraq and Syria, mobs in the streets targeting Jews, murdering and beheading Jews as Jews were being targeted in Europe by the Nazis. In America, this violence, this mob violence, is part of our story too, and I do not want to in any way, shape, or form compare the lynching of Leo Frank to the systematic lynching of Black people, especially across the South in America in the 20th century. But this is an important part of our story. Leo Frank was wrongfully convicted of murder. His death sentence was commuted, and a mob broke in to that jail, ostensibly was let into that jail, and took out Leo and eventually lynched him. And by the way, this was just a few months before the modern KKK reemerged. So these two stories are deeply intertwined. In 1931, as the Nazis were gaining strength across Europe, in Madison Square Garden, one of the most famous buildings on the face of the earth, a proud, open Nazi rally took place. You cannot tell the story of immigration or migration or refugee stories in America without including Jews into that story, because as a byproduct of this type of hatred, Jews were denied refuge in America and in some cases sent back across the ocean to the concentration camps. This bigotry led to legalized discrimination inside of America as well, where Jews were prevented in some cases from owning and buying land or excluded from public property. There were quotas inside of universities limiting the number of Jews that can attend. It was really only in the middle of the 20th century, in the last 50, 60 years, that this type of systemic legalized discrimination was ended for Jews in America. And now, once again, unfortunately, this type of hate and bigotry is rising once more as people feel emboldened to let these ideas out from under the rocks and moving more in towards the mainstream. And as this happens, unfortunately, we see violence targeting Jews once more. Something has happened, though, over the centuries, that when violence targets Jews, oftentimes the response in societies is different. This is the statement of a French editor in 2016, wondering why no one questioned when Jews were killed. And this was an incredibly prescient quote, because the next year, a Jewish retired kindergarten teacher named Sarah Halimi was brutally beaten, viciously stabbed, and thrown off of her balcony as the assailant yelled "Allahu Akbar," but the courts refused to prosecute a murder or a hate crime because the assailant had marijuana in his system. Ultimately, this has been a worldwide story. The problem is not where Jews are. The problem is that Jews are there, and often when Jews aren't even there, they are still blamed for the problems of a society. And so, understandably, there are stories that are being told about the Jewish community that we are simply white and privileged and powerful. And this is not to deny what I look like. It is not to deny the benefits that I receive in this country as a byproduct of the color of my skin. But is to say that when we reduce the conversation around anti-Semitism to one about skin color, it misses the mark with the concerns of the Jewish community, because it misses how anti-Semitism works. I'm going to show you a slightly different story really quickly. On the screen, I'm going to put up a series of maps. On those maps, you're going to see a series of markings. Every marking on those maps is an act of systemic, coordinated mass violence targeting Jews. This is the 13th century in Europe, the 14th century in Europe, the 15th century, the 16th, the 17th, the 18th. Put this all together from 1100 to 1800. There were more than 800 individual violent acts of expulsion, the forcible removal of entire Jewish communities from wherever they lived, and more than 500 mass coordinated murders of Jews across the continent. When we talk about the Holocaust, we usually start that conversation talking about the rise of Hitler and the Nazis in Germany, but we never talk about what seeds the ground for an entire continent to allow what the Nazis ended up doing. And this is what seeded the ground. It is centuries of anti-Jewish hatred and bigotry and rhetoric that spreads, and conspiracy theories that spreads through societies. This is 120 years before Hitler even rises to power. This was the reality. So where Jews presented as white, our skin color didn't protect us. And unfortunately, where Jews presented as people of color, or were part of other non-Christian or non-European nations for generations, our skin color did not protect us either, because the problem is ultimately that we are Jews. As we pivot and start to wind down this part of the presentation, I want to quickly walk through the signs of this mutating virus and show you how anti-Semitism shows up. I'm going to show you these variants. And the way this is going to work is I'm going to put a couple of big ideas on the screen, and then I will walk you through what this sounds like, so you can start to hear the rhetoric and the language and how that language operates. Remember, most of this is about conspiracy theories, so it's not as obvious. All of us have been trained to recognize the swastika. The question is, what about the rest of it, which most of it doesn't present as the swastika? The first idea is that the Jew is all powerful, the idea of Jewish power and Jewish control. And the second is that the Jew can't be trusted, which goes all the way back, as I mentioned, to Judas selling out Jesus to the Romans. What does this sound like? This sounds like the Jews control the media and the banks and the governments. When you hear the phrase the globalists or the deep state or cabals, they're talking ultimately about a Jewish conspiracy. And the phrase Jews will not replace us, which is now made famous by the chants of the marchers in Charlottesville. The Jewish community in America is about 6 million people out of a country that's roughly 330 million. We can't demographically replace anybody. The global Jewish population is roughly 16 million out of, again, a global population of roughly 7.8 billion. We are a rounding error on a spreadsheet. That's how small our global population is. It's something like 0.002%. So when those white nationalists, neo-Nazis were marching and saying, Jews will not replace us, what they were saying is that the Jews are involved in a conspiracy to undermine the white race in America and elevate communities of color in America, in particular Black people. See, these white nationalists believe that white people are superior to all other races, and so how could inferior, quote unquote, races gain status in America? Well, there has to be a secret force behind it, and that is the Jew, according to them. The Jew has been defined as greedy and corrupt. Again, these ideas tie back to Judas, but there's another piece of the story that's really important, which is that in the old European Christian world, Jews were prevented from owning land, and they were also prevented from participating in other forms of work, but they were allowed to work in trade, and they were allowed to work in finance or banking. And keep in mind that Christians in this time were not allowed to do money lending or usury. So the Christian leaders, the Christian European leaders knew that they needed credit in order to keep their economies going, and so they recruited the Jews to help facilitate that process. A few minutes ago, I showed you a screen with all these dots and these markings that showed you this violence across Europe. And the reason that happened was this. When the weather changed and crop yields went down, because Jews couldn't own land, they weren't dramatically impacted. And at the same time, the vast majority of the Christian world in Europe was agrarian, meaning most people's livelihood was dependent on farming. So when crop yields were down, people couldn't feed their family, and of course they responded. And the elites in power offered them a scapegoat, and the scapegoat was the Jew. And because these ideas of Jewish greed and corruption and disloyalty and the uniquely evil nature of the Jew had already been so deeply ingrained in the society, it was really easy for the mob to buy that story. What does that sound like? It sounds like Jewing you down, or that some money is evil, or that the Jews are the 1%. The next idea is that the Jew is a demonic and subhuman or uniquely vile race. This again starts with the death of Jesus, but it morphs in the 11th and 12th century into what's known as the blood libel, the idea that Jews are drinking the blood of Christian children and using that blood in a satanic ritual. And as strange as that sounds, in the modern times, that idea actually had a great deal of traction and continues to pop up. And before I sort of pivot to the next piece of this puzzle, I'm going to quickly stop the screen share for a moment because I want to, in introducing this next piece, touch on something. If people in our country were being attacked on the streets of our country for the actions of another government thousands of years away, thousands of miles away, all good people would respond and say that that was unacceptable. And in May of 2021, Jews across Europe and America were beaten up and attacked on the streets of America. because of the violence between Hamas and Israel. But in that case, many people were unfortunately silent. And I say this and I come off screen for this because I think it is really critical to understand that the idea that somehow Jews might deserve this is deeply ingrained into the cultural DNA of our societies. And what that has led to is the demonization of Israel and the demonization of Jews who support the existence of the state of Israel, which says absolutely nothing about that individual's support for a given policy of the Israeli government at any point in time. And what is happening in many cases is that the Israeli state is being likened to and compared to the Nazis, the swastika overlapping the Jewish star and turning the Israeli flag into a Nazi flag. And this is really critical because all of us understand that the Nazis were a uniquely evil regime on earth. And so when people do this, what they're saying is that Israel is a uniquely evil state, the uniquely evil state. And any Jew who believes in its right to existence, the right to Jewish national self-determination in some part of the land from which we were forcibly and violently removed, is therefore inherently supporting unique evil. And this is distinctly different than criticisms of the policies of a government, which are always fair game. Rather, it is about demonizing the state itself and any Jew who believes in the state's right to exist. What does that sound like? These two ideas work together to call Israelis Nazis or to say that Israelis are intentionally killing Palestinian kids. Or you may have heard the frame Zionists are racist or Zionism is racism. To the Jews, Zionism is the movement for national self-determination and liberation in some portion of our ancestral or indigenous homeland. It is a movement that is 2,000 plus years old ever since Jews were forcibly removed. Most Jews were forcibly removed from that land, though it gets its name in the late 19th century. We understand and I accept that Zionism has meant something very different for the Palestinian people. And again, we shouldn't deny or erase that. But it's important that when you hear this language, you must recognize that the byproduct, regardless of what the intent, the byproduct is to ultimately dehumanize and demonize Jews who believe in the state of Israel's right to exist. All of this brings us back to the central question of how does anti-Semitism work? How is it that this endless cycle that I just showed you examples of has continued its pattern over time? And the answer to that question is that the Jews get cleaved from society, meaning that Jews get isolated, that we get left alone. And I'm about to put two images on screen that are stand-ins for how this works in other cultures. The first image, which some of you may recognize, are marchers, anonymous marchers in Charlottesville. But essentially what has happened throughout the centuries is that the dominant majority in a society blames Jews for the ills of that society, whatever the challenges of the society or the dominant culture might have. In this case, in particular, the idea that Jews are working to uplift people of color, Black people in particular in America. Oftentimes, though, because of how old this virus is, these ideas spread into other communities, into marginalized communities, and Jews, in this case, are attacked as being the oppressor, as being responsible for white supremacy. And what that ends up doing is ultimately isolating Jews in a society, that Jews end up mistrusted or demonized or attacked from all directions in all communities, which leaves Jews isolated and alone. And as we have learned the hard way in this country, and as we are continuing to fight to change in this country, that it is very difficult when systems of oppression and systems of violence target you to prevent those in power from doing it. And unfortunately, this has happened time after time because as demagogues rise and as societies become fractured, as there's economic hardship and war and famine and the bonds of trust that are necessary to protect civil rights in a society begin to fracture, demagogues offer scapegoats. And far too often, the scapegoat that they have offered has been the Jew. And because of these various stereotypes and these conspiracy theories that have spread wildly and widely throughout the world, the Jew has often been an easy target. And that is how this pattern of Jewish history has moved so easily, because the Jews have been isolated within a given society, mistrusted and blamed by all. And so as we wind this down and move to the next portion of our program, some next steps for all of you to think about inviting a speaker into your organization. Spend some time with someone from the other community and share your experiences. To the Jewish community who is watching, spend time with non-Jews, share your personal experiences and listen to theirs. That's really critical, because there may be some things that we as a community need to hear that may be hard for us to hear and accept, but we need to hear and accept them if we are going to build deeper bonds of trust. And consider deepening your education. We can share a list of really good books to help you learn a little bit more about anti-Semitism than we could possibly share tonight in a very short presentation. And with that, I want to conclude my remarks before Q&A and welcome Ellie Cooper to share some personal experiences as well. Ellie?
Thank you. Good evening. I hope everyone had a great week of Hanukkah. Now that I'm a grad student and have a job at the university, I was only able to be home for 3 days of menorah lighting, but nevertheless, it is a truly special time of the year for my family. Ever since I was little, my moms have made a big deal of Hanukkah. They would display the decorations that I made at Sunday school, put our 3-generation menorah front and center on the dining room table, and hang up lights. When I was young, I really loved seeing those beautiful lights. But sadly, those lights, which brought us so much joy during our Hanukkah celebration, became a source of sadness and fear for my family. I was 7 when we first hung our blue lights, our lights made up of dreidels, Magen Davids, and menorahs. We also had a lighted menorah that we hung in front of our window. One morning, either the second or the third day of Hanukkah, we walked out the door to start our day, only to find all 4 of our car tires were slashed. I remember being really scared, and I noticed my moms were scared too. I asked one of my moms before bed that night, "Are we in danger? Does someone want to hurt us?" I couldn't process at that age how someone could be so mean. That was the first time that I learned that some people hate Jews, my first lesson about anti-Semitism. I was a little less innocent after that. However, I learned that the anti-Semitism we faced and experienced, we could not and would not stop being proud of being Jewish. We continued to put our lights out every year and still do. So you all know my name, Ellie Cooper, but let me tell you who I really am. A 4'11" Latina, adopted from Guatemala, the daughter of 2 beautiful white mothers, one of whom is Jewish, like me, and one of whom is Catholic. I am a proud Jewish woman of color who has faced many prejudices. 9 years ago, as a high school freshman, I thought my biggest obstacle was going to be being a Latina. Wrong. It was that and more. But one of the most horrific memories I have was being in the lunch line, and I dropped a quarter and someone behind me said, "Hey, you're a Jew. Don't you want that?" All of that hate was a lot for my 13-year-old self to handle. And so I decided to take action. I became an ADL teen trainer in the Words to Action program. I spoke to kids my age, as well as parents and other adults across the state responding effectively to anti-Semitism and hate. I no longer felt alone. I shared my love for Judaism and the importance of standing up to comments and being proud of all aspects of your identity. It was the first time I realized that my story could help someone or make someone feel just that much less alone. A decade ago, the hate was there. Just under the surface, snide remarks and insults from young people, admonished with, "Honey, you know we don't say things like that," from parents and teachers. Notice not we don't think things like that, only that we don't say them. Well, that hate is not just simmering anymore. And that brings us to where we are and why we are here today. To shine a light, to awaken our fellow humans to the crimes of anti-Semitism. The Anti-Defamation League leads the way in hate crime legislation. Do you know that a hate crime is committed in this country every 90 minutes? And that hate crimes are different from other crimes because, and let me quote ADL here, they have an impact that lingers and extends beyond the victim. I can certainly attest to those feelings. We are here today to say enough. Shine your light and enlighten people to the anti-Semitism that exists in our society. Be the voice for someone who can't speak. Be the voice that speaks loud enough to be heard. Be the voice your heart wants you to be. Speak up for those under attack. Be an ally to the Jewish community. Be like my moms, and don't stop shining those lights at Hanukkah. Shine your light and make a difference. Thank you.
Wow, Ellie, thank you so much for those moving and powerful words, and Oren for just an incredible presentation. We have some questions coming in, and I want to remind everyone to use the Q&A feature to ask your questions, and we'll do our best to answer them in the time we have. I want to begin with a question that is looking back at history. And Oren, I suppose this one is for you. The question acknowledges the fact that anti-Semitism has been with us for a long time. And that the questioner says that there must have been insightful and learned responses to combat it in the past. What can we do now that could be even better or more effective to fight it today?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I actually do think that in the near term, the most important thing that we can do is help our peers better understand who Jews are, what anti-Semitism is, and how anti-Semitism works. Because part of the challenge that we face is that most people can't even identify it when it's there because it's tied to these conspiracy theories and tropes. So that's part of the reason why in the way that I frame the presentation, it's who is the Jew, what is anti-Semitism, right? A racialized form of bigotry as opposed to religious bigotry, which is a really, really complicated, not a complicated idea, but it's a really misunderstood thing. So that if I don't attack your religion, Judy, most people don't think you're doing anything anti-Semitic. And then how does it work? And the reason why the how does it work piece matters, right? That graph that shows it going up and down, is that it's really tempting, understandably, to say, hey, Judy, look at the Jewish community in America. Everything's fine, you're good. But that misunderstands how quickly and rapidly this can change when we allow that rhetoric to move so freely into the mainstream of society. So I don't know that it's really about any specific, here's a great answer, so much as it's really helping people who do want to fight anti-Semitism, make sure that they understand those three things. What does it mean to be a Jew? What is anti-Semitism and how does it work? So that we can recognize the importance of stopping the rhetoric from moving from the fringe into the mainstream of society and then triggering some of the really violent action that we've seen.
Thank you for that. We have a question that I actually think I might be able to take a swing at, which has to do about teaching the Holocaust in public schools as a, not necessarily a cure, an antidote for anti-Semitism, but, and the question is, what can we do as in our communities? And I just want to draw, and I would love you both to answer that, but I just want to draw attention to those who may not know that the Jewish communities across Connecticut and our allies, some of whom are with us tonight, were very effective in helping the state of Connecticut to recognize that we needed to have mandatory Holocaust and genocide education in our public schools. The problem we have in Connecticut is that it's largely unfunded, and the resources are not quite available as they should be to our teachers. But I'd love to hear you both comment on that as well.
Ellie, you want to go first?
Yeah, I think I'm a firm believer in that education is the most important. And I think, especially as someone growing up who had not as many Jewish friends, I definitely think that it's super, super important right now for there to be more Holocaust education, whether that's a field trip or just finding other unique ways, especially now. I think, especially after the year that we've had, finding other ways that we can reach students and also doing it young. And I know that people feel different ways on that, but I am a firm believer that finding approachable ways and finding ways that we can advocate for that and continue to show that it's important for everybody, I believe. I think just as it's important for everybody to have kind of this full circle idea and understanding how we did get here today, and even these ideas of anti-Semitism connect to other things like racism and discrimination that we're still seeing today. So I would agree that I think it's not talked about as much, and I'm hoping to see that it will be in the future.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add to it other than, right, how do we expect to deal with these problems if we're not even aware of them, right? I mean, think about how many Americans after George Floyd was murdered came to find out about the destruction of Black Wall Street, right? That was an unbelievable massacre just a century ago that the average American had no idea about. And so when you even start to talk about the idea of systemic racism and what that means, if you don't have the foundation of history to process that, it's really difficult to make sense of these concerns.
So piggybacking on that concept of history and the foundations that we need, we have a question about the expulsion that you talked about of the Jews of North Africa and the Middle East prior to the establishment of the State of Israel. And the questioner wonders, why aren't we taught about that?
Why aren't we taught about that? Is that the question?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know that I have a great answer to the why aren't we taught about that. I think it's really important just to place that in context, right? Before the establishment of the State of Israel, especially as the Zionism movement grows, right? The movement that sort of is trying to seek a political solution that brings Jews back and establishes a Jewish state in some portion of that land. Part of what ends up happening is that the Jews who are living in these other places, the distrust of them rises, right? Meaning that we can't trust the Jew because they're really out just for the Jew. They're really just Zionists who want to get another state, and they won't be faithful to our state or our people. And so that starts to lead to a rise in anti-Jewish hate in these societies. And then when the State of Israel is actually established, that's when you see like the last kind of final wave of violence and a lot of Jews fleeing from those places. I don't know why people aren't taught about it. It's just to say that a lot of our focus has been, in part because of the Holocaust, has been on sort of the Western world. And the truth is, anti-Semitism has been part of the global fabric. And so I think it's just important to shine light on that story.
Agreed, and shining a light is what we're all about tonight. So we have a question about hate crimes, and I'm wondering if you have any background on why hate crimes are not considered acts of terrorism, since that's what the ultimate goal of them are.
So I think we're getting into a little bit of the legal definition is of an act of terrorism, right? So and I'm not a lawyer, so if there are lawyers present, somebody help me, right? But it's I think it's more about the legal difference between what terrorism is versus the way the hate crime actually unfolds, meaning hate crime impacts an entire community. I think, Ellie, what you said about how it lingers, right? That one attack lingers, that intergenerational trauma, as we talk about, which I think is different than actually necessarily a politically motivated act to try to change a political situation, which I think is usually what we think about as terrorism.
Yeah, that's great. So let me ask you a question, Ellie. Do you have any suggestions for how Jewish institutions can best support young Jews who are experiencing anti-Semitism today?
I think that's a great question. And I suppose what first comes to mind when I hear you say that, and that I didn't know until I found the Anti-Defamation League, is one, understanding what anti-Semitism looks like and what it sounds like. Because I think that oftentimes we feel right now in the world that something has to be very dramatic for it to give you this type of feeling like, oh, that really hurt. And so I didn't understand things like when people would make these kind of sly comments to me that was what I was experiencing was anti-Semitism. Or, I had an incident where I had a swastika painted at the end of my road. And in my mind, it's like, I knew that symbol was wrong. I knew what that meant, but I didn't have the words. I didn't have the right people to talk to help me process those type of feelings and process what that looks like. So I think the first thing is making sure that everybody, not just the educators, but also those who are experiencing it are aware that it's going to come in different forms, especially right now, everything that we're seeing with social media and the power that it has. I think being as prepared as possible for what we can see online, because that's where a lot of people are spending time right now, and just how important it is to be able to have the support to validate those who are experiencing it. Because I think oftentimes, again, it's very easy to brush over and say, yeah, well, that happened, and just keep moving on. And really, it's not until you have time to sit down and process it, or have someone who can give you that type of support, where then we're going to see the difference, where you're able to articulate with your words and say, this is what I experienced, and this is how it affected me. And oh, this affects how I walk down the street, or I notice how somebody looks at me when I wear a Jewish star at school, or how you feel even when you're doing your regular types of routines. I know I felt really different at Shabbat with my family on Fridays, just feeling like I needed to be super private about it. And I think also just finding any way possible to celebrate being Jewish. I think that that's the other part about it, is remembering to still have that joy and still find those ways to make those around you feel proud of who they are, and continue to bring as positive of a pathway during a time when there are many people, and many young people who are experiencing anti-Semitism as well.
Thank you for that. So as a final question, which I have for both and or either of you, it is this: as a non-Jewish ally, how do you suggest it best to combat anti-Semitism?
What I appreciate about the question is that setting aside the specific dynamics of anti-Semitism versus another form of bigotry, it's the notion that you want to be a part of stopping anti-Semitism that matters, right? It's the moving from a place of a passive bystander to an active participant in whatever it is that you're seeing. I think we as Jews need to know that there are people like you out there who are going to speak up when things are happening or when things are said, even if we're not around. When I talk a lot with my friends from other communities about this issue, one of the things I stress is that I know that your expectation of me as an ally for your community is that if I am hearing disparaging remarks at the dinner table, or in some communal event, or just out and about in my daily life, that I don't simply let that slide, that I do something and I say something, so that I let the people around me know that those types of attitudes aren't acceptable. And I think that's really what this is. It's our willingness to stand up and say something when we see it or hear it, that's so critical, because it can push back on the spread of those ideas. I talk a lot in some of my work about slowing down the ripple effect. And if you think about water, right? If water doesn't hit a dam or a levee, it keeps rushing through. You can be the dam and the levee by not allowing the rhetoric to go unchecked in the spaces that you occupy, even if we're not around. And if you do that, you will help slow down the ripple effect and be an impactful ally for us.
I definitely couldn't agree more. And I guess the only other thing that I would add is ask questions. ask questions on, if you're curious about something, or curious even for those, in your own life, if you have a Jewish friend, a Jewish family member, a Jewish classmate, a Jewish coworker. I did have a coworker. I'll give a great example. I had a coworker the other day who knew that I was Jewish and knew that I celebrate Hanukkah. And she was wanting to say happy Hanukkah, but she didn't have quite the words how to say it. And she approached me and she said, listen, I know that you're Jewish and I know that these next few days are Hanukkah. Is it appropriate if I say happy Hanukkah to you? It can be simple things like that make all that bit of difference just in the comfort level. And especially for me in the work environment, that like blew me away, that somebody could just, with compassion. And it wasn't weird, it didn't feel like a weird interaction, and it didn't feel forced. It felt like a genuine, just how I would want to say, to my friends who celebrate Christmas, like, Merry Christmas, is it okay if I say that? And not assuming, every person who you're going to meet who is Jewish, experiences their Judaism differently. And so I think it's really important. That's the other best way that you can be, is just ask questions. And as long as you're moving with compassion, I truly don't believe that there's any one wrong way to be an ally.
Well, that's just remarkable. Thank you both so much for being just so open and willing to share your personal experiences, your family histories, and your expertise. We couldn't be more thrilled. It is now my very special privilege and honor to introduce my very good friend and leader of the Jewish Federation of Greater Hartford, David Warren.
Thank you, Judy. Wow, Eleanor, and that was amazing. Thank you so much. The Shine a Light campaign is based on 3 premises. 1, the best antidote to bigotry is to expose it to the disinfectant of public scrutiny. A critical aim of this campaign and of tonight's program is to educate ourselves and our neighbors about the rising tide of anti-Semitism and other forms of bigotry. 2, leadership counts. It's critical for elected officials and civic and religious leaders to speak out against bigotry loudly and clearly at every opportunity, to send the message that hate will not be tolerated and is indeed antithetical to our nation's core values. 3, most important, fighting hate requires collective action. Joining with interfaith and multicultural partners and good people everywhere to reject all forms of hate and build inclusive, respectful communities. Indeed, the measure of a community is not whether hate crimes and bias incidents occur. The measure of a community is how it responds. And we are grateful for your response tonight. Thank you to Cantor Cadrain, Oren, Ellie, for your inspiring and educational work through song, facts, and personal stories. Thank you to all of our partners in this initiative, and special thanks to our interfaith and multicultural partners for listening to our stories and for your willingness to be allies. Finally, thanks to all of you. Never underestimate the power you have to interrupt prejudice, educate, advocate, build alliances, and indeed ensure that our communities are safe, welcoming, and inclusive for all. Thank you for helping us shine a light on anti-Semitism. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you.